The Yi Zhou Shu is a compendium of Chinese historical documents about the Western Zhou period. Its textual history began with a text compendium known as the Zhou Shu, which was possibly not differentiated from the corpus of the same name in the extant Book of Documents.Western Han dynasty. Editors listed 70 chapters of YZS, of which 59 are extant as texts, and the rest only as chapter titles. Such condition is described for the first time by Wang Shihan in 1669. Circulation ways of the individual chapters before the point are subject to scholarly debates. Traditional Chinese historiography classified the Yi Zhou Shu as Hizashi unofficial history and excluded it from the canonical dynastic 24 histories. Titles. This early Chinese historical text has 4 titles: Zhou Shi, Zhou Shu, Documents Book of Zhou, Yi Zhou Shu, Lost, Leftover Documents Book of Zhou, and Zhaizhong Zhou Shu, Jitum Documents Book of Zhou. Zhou Shi appears once throughout the transmitted texts, in the Zhaojuan along the quote presently found in YZS. The reference is valuable since it differentiates YZS from the corpuses of other documents Shu and possibly refers to its educational function. Zhou Shu, combining Zhou dynasty, and Shu, writing, document, book, letter is the earliest record of the present title. Depending upon the semantic interpretation of Shu, Zhou Shu can be translated Book of Zhou or Documents of Zhou. In modern standard Chinese usage, Zhou Shu is the title of the Book of Zhou history about the later northern Zhou dynasty. Yi Zhou Shu adds Yi, escape, flee, neglect, missing, lost, remain to the title, which scholars interpret in 2 ways: either Lost Book of Zhou, with a literal translation of Yi as lost, or remaining Book of Zhou, with a reading of Yi as remnant, leftover. This dubious tradition began with Lu Xiang describing the text as the solemn statements and orders of the Zhou period. They are in fact the residue of the 100 Paean discussed by Confucius. McNeill translates differently, may well be what remained after Confucius edited the 100 chapters, since the canonical Shangshu in circulation had 29 chapters. McNeill proposes, perhaps sometime during the early Western Han, the transmitted version of the Zhou Shu was expanded so as to produce a text of exactly 71 chapters, so that, added to the 29 chapters of the Shangshu, the so-called 100 chapters of the Shu could be given a literal meaning. This would account for those chapters of the Yi Zhou Shu that seem entirely unrelated or only tentatively related to the main themes of the work. Zhaizhong Zhou Shu derives from a second tradition that the text was found among the manuscripts on bamboo slips unearthed in the Zhaizhong discovery of the tomb of King Xiang of Wei. Shaughnessy concludes that since both of these traditions can be shown to be without foundation, and since all the earliest textual citations refer to it as Zhou Shu, there is now a general scholarly consensus that the title should in fact read simply as Zhou Shu. However, since Zhou Shu also figures as the section of the Book of Documents, the name Yi Zhou Shu has obtained broad currency as safely marking the differentiation. English translations of the Yi Zhou Shu title include Leftover Zhou Writings, Remainder of Zhou Documents, Zhou Documents, Zhou Documents Apocrypha, Remainder of the Zhou Documents, Remnants of Zhou Documents, The Superfluous Book of Zhou. Content. In the 1st century BCE, the Zhou Shu Yi Zhou Shu text consisted of 10 fascicles with 70 chapters and a preface. 11 chapters were lost around the 12th century CE, and only the titles survive. The extant text has 59 chapters and a preface, with a commentary for 42 chapters attributed to the Jin dynasty scholar Kong Zhao. Based upon linguistic and thematic consistencies, Modern scholarship reveals that 32 chapters constitute a textual core treating governmental and military topics. The remaining 27 Yi Zhou Shu chapters are heterogeneous. Some describe historical events ranging from King Wen of Zhou down to King Jing of Zhou. Supplementary chapters record topics such as astronomy and posthumous names. McNeill disagrees with Shaughnessy's claim that there is no discernible organization of the text, and contends there is in fact a chronological presentation of material throughout the progression of most of the chapters. For instance, 18 chapter titles use one of the paired words Wen civil, literary, and Wu military, martial, a literary reference to the Zhou founders, King Wen and King Wu. At least 28 of the 59 extant chapters are unambiguously set in the pre-dynastic reigns of Kings Wen and Wu during the immediate time of the conquest of Shang. Date and place of composition. According to Shaughnessy, the Yi Zhou Shu underwent two textual redactions. First, sometime in the late 4th or early 3rd century BCE, an anonymous editor compiled the 32 core chapters. These have linguistic and intellectual features characteristic of Warring States writings, and were quoted in classics such as the Zhuozhuan, Hanfizi, and Zhangos. Second, no later than the early 1st century BCE, another editor, possibly the preface's author, composed a redaction with 70 chapters and a preface. Some secondary chapters are earlier than the core and others are later. For instance, chapter 32 Wushan uses the term Dai Emperor. McNeill interprets it as a late 3rd century BC date, when Dai came to mean emperor. Zhou Yucheng claimed that, though possibly not produced in the early Zhou YZS, he had no features of the Warring States Qin Han forgery. The philosophical lineage of the Yi Zhou Shu within the 100 schools of thought remains uncertain. According to McNeill, several schools emphasized the concept of Wen and Wu as the civil and martial spheres of government as comprising a comprehensive totality. Quote, in particular, the concept was highlighted by the famous ancient military strategist Jiang Zira Taigong, who is known through the writings of Su Qin from the School of Diplomacy or School of Vertical and Horizontal. According to Chinese scholars, possible transmission line of the earliest YZS chapters went through the state of Jin and its subsequently divided territories. It is attested by the preserved textual quotes, most of which are ascribed to Jin Personi. A number of thematic parallels are found between YZS and the Wenzi, which is reported to be also produced in Jin. Textual history. The bibliography sections of the 24 histories provide valuable diachronic data. The Book of Han Imperial Bibliography records the Zhuxiu, or Zhuxiji, in 71 chapters. The Book of Sui lists his Zhuxiu in 10 fascicles, and notes it derived from the Jiazhong discovery. Zhan Shigu, annotating Yuwengzhi, states that of the 71 YZS chapters only 45 are extant. However, Liu Zhiji claims that all 71 original chapters were extant. The Old Book of Tang bibliography lists an 8-fascicle Zhuxiu with annotations by Kong Chao. The New Book of Tang lists both of Jiazhong Zhuxiu in 10 fascicles and Kong Chao's annotated Zhuxiu in 8. The history of Song and subsequent dynastic histories only list the Jiazhong Zhuxiu in 10 fascicles. Shaughnessy concludes that two separate versions existed up until the Tang period: the 8-fascicle Kongchao Zhuxiu and the 10-fascicle Jiazhong Zhuxiu. These two textual versions were assimilated during the Northern Song period, and the loss of 11 chapters occurred before the Middle Southern Song. Both these traditions, associating the extant Yi Zhou Shu to Jiazhong texts at Kong's edition, have dubious historicity. First, contemporary research on the Yi Zhou Shu has conclusively demonstrated that the received text could not have been recovered from Zhang's tomb along with the Bamboo Annals. Shaughnessy explains that the Yi Zhou Shu was extant is an integral text, known as the Zhou Shu, throughout the nearly 6 centuries from King Zhang's burial in 296 BC through the opening of the tomb in 280 AD. Some chapters have internal evidence of being written after the 221 BCE Qin dynasty unification. Second, it is unlikely that Kong Chao, author of the earliest commentary, consulted the Zhaizhong documents. The dates of Kong's life are uncertain, but he was a close contemporary of Wang Shihan, and the last historical reference to him was in an imperial invitation of 266. Shaughnessy says Kong's commentary was added to the text sometime in the middle of the 3rd century AD, but certainly before the 280 opening of King Zhang's tomb. Histories listed many scholars but not Kong Chao, who worked on deciphering the bamboo strips. Yi Zhou Shu commentaries began with Kong Chao in the 3rd century and continue in the present day. Kong's commentary is extant for 42 of the 59 chapters, and has been included in most editions. Qing dynasty scholarship produced valuable Yi Zhou Shu commentaries and editions. The text-critical edition of Lu Wenchao was based on 8 Yuan dynasty and Ming dynasty versions, and includes 12 earlier Qing commentaries. The Sibu Beiyao series reprinted Lu's edition, which is called the Baojing Study version. The Sibu Kongkan collection reproduced the earliest edition, a version by Zhang Bo printed at the Jiaxing Provincial Academy. Compared with most other Chinese classics, the Yi Zhou Shu has been neglected by scholars both Chinese and Western. McNeill suggests a bias against the work, perhaps originating in part from the misconception that it comprised those Zhou documents that Confucius deemed unfit for inclusion in his canonical edition of the Shangshu, or venerated documents, has contributed to the relative neglect of this text. Parallel texts and epigraphics. The text close to the known version of YZS was known to Sima Qian. Numerous parallels are found in the Shiji account on Zhou history, and the YZS Yin and Duri chapters are basically incorporated into the Shiji in the full form. The observation was made by Ding Fu ZH. Among the excavated sources on YZS Bamboo Cache of Sili County, Zhangjiaji, Hunan contains fairly complete text of YZS number 8 Dawu. Fragments of Yi Zhou Shu were identified in the Tsinghua bamboo slips. Traditional scholarly attitudes. The Shifu document was condemned by Mencius and ignored by Sima Qian, which is probably part of the reason it is found in the Yi Zhou Shu today instead of the Book of Documents. After its compilation, the Yi Zhou Shu was condemned as inadequate representation of history by the traditional Confucian scholars of the late imperial period, beginning from the Song dynasty. The standpoints were characterized by merging of moralistic judgment into textual criticism. Most pronounced condemnation came from Fang Xiaoru. Fang claimed that YZS contained exaggerations and immoral notions ascribed to the past sages. He concluded on those grounds that they could not have been authentic Zhou documents, and thus Lu Zhang's claim that they had been left over by Confucius was necessarily false. Bibliography. Falkenhausen, Lothar von, The Concept of When in the Ancient Chinese Ancestral Cult, Chinese Literature, Essays, Articles, Reviews 18-1-22. Lee, Thomas H. C. Education in Traditional China, A History, Brill. Luo Jiakang, Yi Zhou Shu, Zhanjiu, Shanghai, Shanghai Gujitu Banch. McNeill, Robin. The Body as Metaphor for the Civil and Martial Components of Empire in Yi Zhou Shu. Chapter 32, with an excursion on the composition and structure of the Yi Zhou Shu. Journal of the American Oriental Society 122.1, 46-60. McNeill, Robin. Conquer and Govern. Early Chinese Military Texts from the Yi Zhou Shu. Honolulu, University of Hawaii Press. Shaughnessy, Edward L. On the Authenticity of the Bamboo Annals, Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies 46.1, 149-180. Shaughnessy, Edward L. Yi Zhou Shu, In Early Chinese Texts, a Bibliographical Guide, edited by Michael Low, Institute of East Asian Studies, pp. 229-232. Shaughnessy, Edward L. Western Zhou History, in M. Low and E. L. Shaughnessy, eds. The Cambridge History of Ancient China, for the Origins of Civilization to 221 BC, Cambridge University Press, pp. 292-351. Shaughnessy, Edward L. Rewriting Early Chinese Texts, State University of New York Press. Theobald Ulrich, Yi Zhou Shu, China Knowledge. Wilkinson, Endymion, Chinese History, a Manual, revised and enlarged ed. Harvard University Asia Center. Zhou Yuxiu, Yi Zhou Shu, The Yuan Tidian Jiqi Wenxiang Zujiaja, Beijing, Zhonghua Shuzhu.